As a federal prosecutor for nearly 20 years, I can tell you that I have seen a lot. Those who sacrifice to make us safe, and I have seen the worst traits of humanity, those who are driven by abuse, by greed, and hatred. I am not here to lecture you about the law or about any piece of jurisprudence, so you're okay. I am here to tell you a story. I want to share with you an experience that was very meaningful to me and something that came to mind immediately when I realized that we were here together as a community to discuss the concept of escape. And for a prosecutor, I will tell you that the word escape makes me a little uneasy. This story starts in Cuba, and it starts after the 1959 revolution when Fidel Castro takes over the island. And it starts at a place, a psychiatric hospital named Mazorra Psychiatric Hospital on the outskirts of Havana. On the outside, visitors will go and they'll say, manicured lawns, beautiful white walls, pristine. But on the inside, Cubans in the island, especially in the 1940s and 50s, will tell you that they described it as Dante's Inferno. You see, the name Mazorra alone stirs up feelings of dread and memories of antiquated psychiatric treatments on patients. Patients screaming in the middle of the night, shackled to their beds, naked, hungry, abandoned. Actually, if you look up Mazorra Hospital and you research it, you will find images such as this one, where patients are said to have died because of the abandonment and the neglect and the hunger. Now, after the revolution, Mazorra Hospital became part of the Cuban state, like all institutions. And it was part of the prison system. And what they did is that they would use Mazorra Hospital to imprison political prisoners. And in Cuba, a political prisoner can involve a myriad of offenders. It could be someone who wrote against the Castro regime. It can be someone who evaded the draft, or someone who got on the raft and tried to escape but got picked up and brought right back. And they were sent to two specific wards in Mazorra. And these wards were a series of tiny cells with iron bars, dark, no windows, no furniture except for a metal-framed bed, some with a thin, soiled mattress, others with no mattress at all, no toilets or any sanitary installations. Now, there was somebody who was in charge of these prison wards at Mazorra, a head nurse by the name of Eriberto Mederos. Now, Mederos had one job, and his job was to torture the political prisoners in Mazorra. And he did it by using an electric shock machine, originally used to help patients with electroconvulsive therapy. But in this case, he was using the electric shock machine for political tool, to pressure, to persuade, to punish, to reorient. And when you see a lot of human rights reports about what happened at Mazorra under Mederos' watch, the stories from the inmates were all the same. You're arrested, some for just some passive resistance against the government. You're brought to Mazorra, thrown into these dirty, bare cells. There are no toilets, as I said, so to relieve yourself, you had to do that on the concrete floors of your cells. At times, they would clean the cells by coming in either with a hose or with a bucket of water, throwing the water into the cell, and then having that dirty water with the urine and the feces stream down, forming puddles on the hallway in front of the cells. Then a couple of days later, Mederos would come in. He would be accompanied usually with two large inmates that were trusted. And they would take a prisoner one by one, and they would take them and hold them down into that puddled, dirty water with the urine. And Mederos would take those electrodes, fasten them onto their temples, and then administer the shocks. And as he administered those shocks, there was no anesthesia, no pain reliever, no mouth protection. These political prisoners would go into convulsions, many of them biting deep into their tongues, creating a bloody mess. Many of them went unconscious. They lost control of their bladder and their bowels. Often, they screamed in pain. If you were lucky, you only got electrocuted 3 times when you were there by Mederos. If you were not so lucky, you would get electrocuted 3 times a week for up to 3 months. All the while, as these prisoners would tell you, Mederos smiling or laughing as he would do this. And this went on for years in the 60s and 70s. And now let's fast forward to the 80s. As you know from American history, we had a migration accord with Cuba with the Mariel boat lift in 1980. And many came. And 4 years after that, in 1984, Mederos came to the United States, leaving behind his memories, leaving behind what he had done, escaping, if you will, any consequences for the actions that he had committed. He came here without telling anybody who he really was, without really saying what he had done. And he applied to become a U.S. citizen in 1992. And in 1993, Mederos became a naturalized U.S. citizen. Now, just like he came, so did other inmates and prisoners and other Cuban Americans that came over, also trying to leave behind everything that they had seen, the brutal dictatorship. And one of those inmates, former prisoners, was a man named Eugenio de Sosa. De Sosa was a publisher for the Havana newspaper who had written against Castro. And he, because of that, endured 21 years of prison. And when De Sosa was 60 years old in 1977, he was taken to meet Mederos. And when he met Mederos, De Sosa describes how Mederos placed those electrodes on his temples 4 times and on his sexual organs and his testicles 10 times. When De Sosa, after he was released, was interviewed and asked about this experience, he was quoted as saying, "You feel like an explosion in your head and you lose your consciousness." Now, De Sosa was released, and luckily he also made it to Miami, living a new life, a new start, beautiful family. Years went by, trying to put that horrible chapter in his life behind him. And in April of 1992, he paid his weekly visit to his elderly aunt who lived in a convalescent home in Hialeah, Florida, just 15 miles right from here. And on that day, which is usually a quiet family affair, you can imagine the horror and the terror in De Sosa's eyes when he sees Mederos, his torturer, working in that same convalescent home and working as a nurse. De Sosa confronts him. Mederos denies it, takes off running. At that point, De Sosa calls the FBI. I had just thereafter started working as a young, sort of experienced but not so much prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I get assigned to the case. And I get assigned to the case with a senior prosecutor by the name of Frank Taman. And together we start listening and hearing, and that's when I started learning about all the atrocities that had happened under Mederos at Mazorra Hospital. And as the investigation broke, so did too a lot of articles being written in the Miami Herald about the fact that the presence of this man was evoking such horrible memories here in South Florida. And as the case continued, victims started to, some of them, as you can understand, reluctantly, they didn't want to relive this. They didn't want to have to go back and think about what had happened to them, but they did. Some of them were very brave, like Victor Hernandez, who's shown here, and you can see the agony in his face when he is retelling the story about his brother, Rene, in the smaller picture, died at the hand of Mederos. And as we kept getting all this information, we started trying to build a case, trying to figure out how do you charge someone for having committed these crimes, not in the United States, but in Cuba. And we started looking looking at all the evidence that we can find, and we came up with a theory. Even though we didn't have many federal statutes about crimes being committed somewhere else, we thought about charging Mederos for having lied when he became a U.S. citizen. You see, when you become a U.S. citizen, you have to swear to many statements, right? And two of those statements that Mederos falsely swore to was, one, that he had no affiliation whatsoever, any connection to the Communist Party, which he did. And second, he falsely swore that he never persecuted anyone for their political opinions. And then at that point, we charged him, and Mederos was arrested in 2001 on this immigration theory and criminal charge. And as we put the case together, we went to trial. Now, in trial, on the prosecution side, there was De Sosa's daughter, the victim, who identified Mederos. See, De Sosa died before the trial commenced, but his daughter was there to represent him. So there were scores of Cuban Americans that have come to Miami, and one of them being my mom. You see, I'm a firstborn Cuban American. And to have my mom there, for her, it was once again, like a lot of the Cuban Americans, they were basically there to see that justice be done and to relive and remember and have everybody remember about the atrocities as to why they left. And on the defense's side, on Mederos, there was one person that went there every day, just one, his grandson, a teenager, someone who only knew him as abuelo, someone who, there's no way that that can be true. All these horrible things that they're telling me about my grandfather, but he stood there every day. And when the trial commenced, victims came one after another, talking about how their mouths were foam after Mederos has tortured them, how the skin by their temples were burning from this torture. Some of them asking Mederos, "Why are you doing this to me?" And Mederos responding as he's electrocuting them, "Because you're against the revolution, and I can kill you, and no one will do anything to me." One victim, the only female victim that testified, told the jury how she was dragged by her hair by Mederos and then injected with insulin 3 times a day to lower her sugar levels, almost to a state of a coma. And then Mederos would have her and force her to drink 10 to 12 glasses of sugar water to get those levels back up, bringing her in and out of consciousness. And there was one witness that I will never forget. It was a man who was 40 years old when he testified, but he was 15 when he was tortured by Mederos. A 15-year-old who was in prison because he was distributing propaganda, doing graffiti against Castro's regime, but then taken to see Mederos. When I was preparing him for trial, he kept telling me, "Yes, Mr. Ferrer, he electrocuted me, but I got him good. I punched him, I kicked him, he hurt as well." And I kept saying, "Listen, I understand, but this is not about what you did to him. This trial is about what he did to you." He said, yeah, I got it. So we go to trial. He gets on the stand, and I ask him the same questions, and he does exactly the same thing. Yes, he electrocuted me. Yes, he forced me to take these psychopathic drugs that I did not need, but man, I really got him. He did not break me. I hurt him as well. I sat down. At that point, the defense attorney gets up, and he tries to find an inconsistency in his story. Now, we had no pictures. Remember, this happened in Cuba 25 years earlier. So the defense attorney thought that by doing something clever that he would get him to trip up. And he put up this board, a rough schematic diagram of the inside of the Mazorra Hospital, showing where the cells would have been, where the hallway was, and the offices. And this witness, this 40-year-old, with that tough exterior, takes a look at that. It's the first time he had ever seen a depiction of what he had gone through when he was 15 years old. He stopped. He couldn't even hardly speak. And this 40-year-old man before our eyes transformed back to that 15-year-old, crying, sobbing. There was not a dry eye in the courtroom, especially mine and some of the jurors. And through his tears, he told the jury how this man had hurt him, how afraid he was as a 15-year-old going through this, not understanding why this was happening to him. But then he told Mederos in the middle of that trial, through his tears, "You're not in control anymore, I am. And I'm going to tell the world what you did to me, and I'm doing it now." And after 3 weeks of trial, Mederos was convicted by the jury. This was the first conviction ever for someone having committed human rights abuses outside the United States since World War II. And I will tell you that as a Cuban American, this conviction and this experience reinforced all the reasons as to why I got into the law and become a public servant. Because when my parents emigrated to this country, they told my brother and me that we were not to sit on the sidelines, but to get involved. And having my mom there was such an amazing moment because I will never forget being part of a case as a team where we sent to prison someone who represented every reason as to why a lot of the Cuban Americans left the brutal dictatorship. But I saw something also very remarkable after the trial. The victim's daughter, De Sosa's daughter, got up and went to the grandson, the boy who was sitting there, shocked, dumbfounded that his grandfather was found guilty. And she hugged him, and she told him, "This is not your fault. You're going to be okay." So I've learned a lot of lessons in this experience. I learned that you can't escape justice. It will catch up with you, and you can't escape the sins of your past. It will catch up to you one way or another. May not be today, may not be tomorrow, may not be in 20 years. For Mederos, it was 25 years later after what he had done, and weeks before his final days. You see, I did not know during the whole trial that he was sick, and he lost the will to live. So when he was sent to prison, he actually died in a hospital. Ironically, in a very similar setting that his victims had to endure when they were hurt by him. I also learned from this experience that you can't run away from the pain and suffering of your past memories. I realized from working with these victims and these witnesses that our experiences make us who we are, good or bad, and that there's a real value to coping and accepting and dealing. And that you can't even erase it by even going to another country, learning another language and another culture. And sometimes you can't even evade something that had nothing to do with you, like the grandson. These courageous victims showed me that by dealing head-on with their memories and their experiences, they were able to take a mastery of their past, and they were able to revisit what had happened to them from a position of strength and courage, telling everyone that they were survivors and telling everyone that they were not ashamed to be in a fight that was so unfair. So at the end, what I learned is that sometimes confronting your memories and not escaping could be an incredibly powerful and transformative experience. Thank you.